May 15, 1918. 0200 hours. Argonne Forest, France. Private Henry Johnson heard the sound of wire cutters working in the darkness ahead of his position. For a moment, he hoped he was imagining it. Just nerves playing tricks after too many hours on watch in the cold and dark. But then he heard it again. The distinct metallic snap of steel cutting through barbed wire. Someone was out there, cutting to protect a barrier between the American listening post and no man's land. Johnson whispered to his partner, Private Needham Roberts. "You hear that?" Roberts nodded. He'd heard it too. Both men grabbed their rifles. French-made Lebel rifles that had been issued to them when the American Army had loaned their entire regiment to the French because the United States military didn't trust black soldiers to fight alongside white troops. Then came the grenades. A box of them, German stick grenades, thrown in a cluster toward the listening post. The explosions were deafening in the quiet night. Robert screamed. He'd been hit by shrapnel, badly wounded, unable to stand. And through the smoke and chaos, Johnson could see shapes emerging from the darkness. Not one or two German soldiers. More than a dozen, maybe 24. All of them moving toward the listening post with one clear objective. Capture the two American soldiers for interrogation, lure about Allied positions and strength, then either kill them or take them as prisoners of war. Henry Johnson was 25 years old, stood 5 feet 4 inches tall, and weighed about 130 pounds. Before the war, he'd been a railroad porter in Albany, New York, one of the few jobs available to black men in early 20th century America. He had no military experience before volunteering. He'd received minimal training because the U.S. Army didn't consider black soldiers worth training properly. His rifle had jammed after 3 shots. French Lebel rifles had a reputation for mechanical problems. And now he was facing at least 24 German soldiers who were trying to capture or kill him and drag his wounded partner away as a prisoner. Johnson looked at the Germans closing in, looked at his wounded partner Roberts, who couldn't defend himself, looked at the Bolo knife hanging from his belt, a large, heavy blade designed for chopping, not standard military issue, but something Johnson had acquired and carried as a personal weapon. And Private Henry Johnson made a decision that would make him one of the most famous soldiers of World War I, earn him France's Croix de Guerre, inspire black Americans fighting for equality, and 97 years later, long after he died poor and forgotten in a segregated America that never properly honored his service, earn him the Medal of Honor. He charged into 24 German soldiers with nothing but a knife. This is the story of Henry Johnson and the Battle of Henry Johnson, as it came to be known. It's the story of the Harlem Hellfighters, the all-black 369th Infantry Regiment that fought longer and with more distinction than almost any American unit in World War I, but was denied recognition because of the color of their skin. It's the story of 2 men who fought impossible odds to protect each other. And it's the story of how America treated its black soldiers, sent them to war, watched them perform heroically, then brought them home to the same racism and discrimination they'd left behind, denying the honors they'd earned until nearly a century had passed. Henry Lincoln Johnson was born in 1892 in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, though he would spend most of his life in Albany, New York. His early life was typical of black Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Poor, limited opportunities, constant exposure to racism and discrimination, work when you could find it, and acceptance of whatever terms were offered because refusing meant not eating. Johnson worked various jobs in Albany. He was a laborer, a chauffeur, and eventually a railroad porter, one of the few relatively stable jobs available to black men. Railroad porters worked on passenger trains, carrying luggage, serving meals, attending to passengers' needs, and enduring constant casual racism from travelers who treated them as servants rather than workers. The pay was poor, the hours were long, and the job required absolute subservience to white passengers regardless of how they treated you. But it was steady work. And in early 20th century America, steady work for a black man was not something to take for granted. Johnson stood about 5 feet 4 inches tall and weighed approximately 130 pounds. He was short, thin, and physically unimposing, not the sort of man you'd look and think soldier. But Johnson had something that couldn't be measured by height or weight. He had pride, determination, and a strong sense of duty. In April 1917, the United States entered World War I. President Woodrow Wilson asked Congress to declare war on Germany, arguing that America needed to make the world safe for democracy. The irony of this statement was not lost on black Americans, who lived in a country where they were denied the right to vote in many states, were systematically discriminated against, were subject to Jim Crow laws that enforced racial segregation, and lived under constant threat of lynching and racial violence. America wanted to save democracy in Europe while denying it to millions of its own citizens at home. But despite, or perhaps because of, this hypocrisy, Black Americans volunteered for military service in large numbers when the war began. Some volunteered out of patriotism, genuine love of country despite how the country treated them. Others volunteered because they believed that military service might prove their worth, that if Black men fought and died for America, maybe America would finally grant them the rights and respect they deserved. And some volunteered for practical reasons. Military service paid better than most jobs available to Black men, and the Army at least provided food and shelter even if it provided little else. Henry Johnson volunteered for service in 1917, joining what would become the 369th Infantry Regiment of the New York National Guard, an all-Black unit that was initially called the 15th New York National Guard Regiment. The regiment was nicknamed the Harlem Hellfighters, a name that would become famous, though it wasn't clear who came up with the nickname. Some said it was the Germans who gave them the name because they fought so fiercely. Others said it was the regiment itself as a source of pride. Needham Roberts was younger than Johnson, born in 1901 in Trenton, New Jersey. He was only 16 or 17 years old when he enlisted. Lie about his age as many young men did to get into the service. Roberts had even less life experience than Johnson. He'd worked various manual labor jobs, but hadn't yet established himself in any trade or profession. He was tall, thin, and by all accounts quiet and reserved, not the sort of young man who stood out in the crowd. The 369th Infantry Regiment was formed in Harlem, New York, and most of its members were Black men from New York City and surrounding areas. The regiment's existence was itself a compromise. The U.S. military was strictly segregated. Black soldiers and white soldiers didn't serve in the same units, didn't train together, didn't fight together. The military's official position was that Black men lacked the intelligence, discipline, and courage to serve as combat soldiers. They could work as laborers, cooks, stevedores, and other support roles, but actual combat was considered beyond their capabilities. This belief was not based on any evidence. It was pure racism, a convenient justification for maintaining segregation and denying Black soldiers opportunities for advancement and recognition. But it was official policy, enforced at the highest levels of the military and government. The 369th Regiment and other Black units existed in a strange limbo. They were infantry regiments, theoretically trained for combat, but the Army had no real intention of using them in fighting roles. The plan was to send them to France and assign them to labor battalions, digging trenches, building roads, unloading ships, all the unglamorous and dangerous work that had to be done to support an army, but that white officers didn't want white soldiers doing. Training for the 369th was minimal and deliberately inadequate. The regiment was issued outdated equipment. Rifles that didn't work properly, insufficient ammunition for training, worn-out uniforms. They drilled with wooden rifles because the Army didn't consider it worth the expense to give Black soldiers real weapons for training. Their officers were mostly white. The Army didn't trust Black men to lead other Black men, and many of these white officers were openly racist, viewing their assignment to a Black regiment as punishment or as a dead-end career posting. The men of the 369 trained as best they could with what they had. They marched, drilled, learned basic military discipline. But they weren't trained in combat tactics, weren't taught how to fight effectively, weren't prepared for realities of warfare. The assumption was that they'd never need to know how to fight, because they'd never be sent into combat. In late 1917, the 369th Infantry Regiment was sent to France. They arrived expecting to be assigned to labor battalions like other Black units. Instead, something unusual happened. The American Expeditionary Force commander, General John Pershing, faced a difficult problem. The French army had been fighting since 1914 and had suffered catastrophic casualties. Millions of French soldiers killed or wounded. The French desperately needed reinforcements, but American units arriving in France were being held back by Pershing, who wanted to keep them together as an independent American army rather than scattering them among French units. The French asked for American reinforcements. Pershing didn't want to give them white American units, but he had several Black regiments that he didn't know what to do with and didn't particularly want. The solution was obvious. Loan the Black regiments to the French army. The French could use them as combat troops. Pershing wouldn't have to figure out how to employ them in a segregated American army. And if the Black soldier performed poorly or suffered heavy casualties, it wouldn't reflect badly on the American military. So the 369th Infantry Regiment, along with several other Black American units, was transferred to the French Army and assigned to the French 16th Division. The transfer probably saved the regiment. The French Army, while not free from racism, had a very different attitude toward colonial and non-white soldiers than the American military. The French had been using troops from their African colonies throughout the war, and while these colonial troops faced discrimination, they were still treated as soldiers, given proper equipment and training and used in combat roles. When the 369th arrived at their French assignment, they turned in their American equipment and were issued French weapons, uniforms, and gear. They received French helmets, the distinctive Adrian helmet, while keeping their American uniforms, creating a unique look that would become famous in photographs. They were issued Lebel rifles, the standard French infantry rifle, along with ammunition and grenades. And most importantly, they were trained by French officers and NCOs who had years of combat experience and who taught them actual combat tactics, trench warfare techniques, and how to survive on the Western Front. The men of the 369th responded to this training with enthusiasm. Finally, someone was taking them seriously as soldiers, giving them real weapons and real training, treating them as men capable of fighting rather than as laborers only good for digging ditches. The French soldiers and officers who worked with the 369th were often surprised by how capable the American black soldiers were, not because the French had expected them to be incompetent, but because the Americans had been so insistent that black soldiers couldn't fight that the French had half believed it. By May 1918, the 369th Infantry Regiment had been in combat for several months. They'd been assigned to a sector of the front line in the Argonne forest region, a heavily wooded area in northeastern France that was relatively quiet compared to other parts of front, but still dangerous. The Western Front in World War I was characterized by trench warfare. Two armies dug into elaborate networks of trenches facing each other across no man's land, the devastated area between the trench lines. Combat consisted of artillery bombardments, occasional infantry assaults, constant sniper fire, and frequent small raids where one side or the other would send soldiers across no man's land to attack enemy trenches, capture prisoners for interrogation, or simply kill enemy soldiers and destroy fortifications. The 369th's sector was relatively quiet in terms of major attacks, but saw constant small-scale action. Soldiers rotated between frontline trenches, support trenches, and rest areas behind the lines. When in the frontline trenches, men were on constant alert, watching for German raids, repairing defenses, and manning listening posts. Small forward positions, even closer to the German lines in the main trenches, manned by 2 or 3 soldiers whose job was to watch and listen for any German activity and raise the alarm if an attack was coming. Listening posts were among the most dangerous assignments. You were isolated from your unit, exposed to German fire, and if the Germans launched a raid, you were the first target. The Germans particularly liked to raid listening posts to capture prisoners. Isolated, undermanned positions were easier to overwhelm the main trench lines, and captured soldiers could be interrogated for intelligence about Allied strength and plans. On the night of May 14th to 15th, 1918, Private Henry Johnson and Private Needham Roberts were assigned to man a listening post about 50 meters in front of the main American trenches. It was a small position, basically a shallow hole or small dugout, with barbed wire barriers providing some protection from German approach. The two men were issued rifles, ammunition, grenades, and had orders to watch for German activity and sound the alarm if anything suspicious happened. Johnson and Roberts had served together for months by this point. They weren't close friends. Johnson was 25, older and more experienced, while Roberts was still a teenager, but they developed the kind of functional working relationship that soldiers in the same unit develop. They trusted each other to do their jobs, and that trust was about to be tested in the most extreme way possible. As midnight passed and the early morning hours of May 15th approached, both men were tired, cold, and bored. Listening post duty meant sitting in the dark for hours, straining to hear anything unusual, jumping at every sound, trying to stay alert despite the numbing monotony. The weather was cool, typical for mid-May in northern France. The front was quiet. No artillery, no rifle fire, just the occasional distant sound of activity from the German trenches several hundred meters away. At approximately 0200 hours, 2 a.m., Henry Johnson heard something that made him freeze. The sound of wire cutters. Someone was cutting through the barbed wire barriers in front of the listening post. Germans were coming. Johnson whispered urgently to Roberts, "You hear that?" Roberts had heard it too. Both men grabbed their rifles and strained their eyes trying to see movement in the darkness. World War I night combat was fought in almost complete darkness. No artificial lighting, no night vision equipment. Just moonlight if you were lucky and pitch blackness if you weren't. On this night, there was enough ambient light to see shapes and movement, but not enough to identify targets clearly or judge distances accurately. The wire-cutting sounds continued. Germans were definitely out there, cutting through protective barriers, preparing to raid the listening post. Johnson and Roberts had two options: sound the alarm immediately and retreat to the main trenches, or wait to see what developed and try to fight off the raid themselves if it was small enough to handle. They never got a chance to decide. A cluster of German stick grenades came flying out of the darkness toward their position. Stick grenades, the distinctive German steel hand grenade with a wooden handle and metal explosive head, were being thrown in groups, a tactic designed to create maximum blast effect and overwhelm defenders with explosions and shrapnel. The grenades exploded. The blasts were devastating at close range, creating shock waves that knocked both Americans down and filled the air with dirt, smoke, and flying metal fragments. Roberts was hit badly. Multiple pieces of shrapnel tore into his arms, side, and legs. He screamed in pain, fell, and tried to apply pressure to his wounds with his hands. Blood was everywhere. Roberts was alive but badly wounded, possibly dying, and certainly unable to fight effectively. Johnson had been partially shielded from the grenades by the contours of the listening post, and had suffered only minor wounds from fragments. But the explosions had temporarily stunned him. His ears were ringing from the blasts. His vision was blurred from the smoke and concussion, and for a few seconds he couldn't process what was happening. Then the Germans charged. Through the smoke and darkness, Johnson could see shapes emerging. German soldiers, lots of them, far more than 2 men in a listening post could reasonably expect to fight off. Later estimates would put the raiding party at approximately 24 German soldiers, though in the chaos of night combat Johnson couldn't count them accurately. All he knew was that there were many enemies and only 2 defenders, and one of those defenders was badly wounded and out of fight. Johnson raised his rifle, the French Lebel Model 1886, an 8mm bolt-action rifle with an 8-round tubular magazine, and fired at the approaching Germans. The Lebel was not a particularly good rifle. It was old, designed in the 1880s, and had several mechanical problems that made it inferior to more modern rifles. The tubular magazine was slow to reload, the action was prone to jamming, and the rifle was longer and heavier than it needed to be. But it would fire, and Johnson was close enough to the Germans that accuracy wasn't difficult. Johnson fired. A German soldier fell. Johnson cycled the bolt, aimed, fired again. Another German went down. Third shot, third German hit. Johnson had killed or seriously wounded 3 enemy soldiers in perhaps 5 seconds of shooting. Then the rifle jammed. The bolt stuck partially open, unable to chamber another round. Johnson tried to work the action, to clear the jam and get the rifle firing again. But in the darkness and chaos, he couldn't figure out what was wrong. And the Germans were still coming. They were less than 10 feet away now, close enough that Johnson could see their faces in the dim light, close enough that they could have shot him easily if they'd wanted to kill him. But they didn't shoot. The Germans were carrying rifles with bayonets fixed, but they weren't firing their weapons. This told Johnson something important. This was a prisoner snatch raid, not an attack designed to kill defenders. The Germans wanted to capture American soldiers alive, drag them back to German lines, interrogate them for intelligence, and maybe use them for propaganda purposes, proof that the Germans could raid American positions at will and that American soldiers couldn't defend themselves. Several Germans moved past Johnson toward Roberts, who was lying wounded and helpless on the ground. They were going to capture Roberts, drag him back across no man's land, and take him prisoner. Johnson could see them reaching for Roberts, grabbing his arm to pull him up and carry him away. And that's when Henry Johnson, 5 feet 4 inches tall, 130 pounds, a railroad porter from Albany with no combat experience before a few months ago, made a decision that would define his life and legacy. He couldn't let them take Roberts. Roberts was his partner, had been sitting next to him in this listening post for hours, was a fellow soldier and a fellow black American serving a country that didn't respect him but depending on each other for survival. Johnson couldn't save himself. The odds were impossible, but he could try to save Roberts. Or at least he could die trying, which seemed preferable to letting the Germans capture his wounded partner without a fight. Johnson dropped the jammed rifle, grabbed a Bolo knife from his belt, and charged into 24 German soldiers. A Bolo knife is not standard military equipment. It's a large, heavy blade with single cutting edge, originally designed as a tool for cutting through dense vegetation in tropical environments. American soldiers in the Philippines had used Bolo knives during the Philippine-American War at the turn of the 20th century, and some soldiers continue to carry them as personal weapons. The blade is typically 12 to 18 inches long, thick and heavy, designed for chopping rather than stabbing, more like a machete than a combat knife. Johnson had acquired a Bolo knife at some point during his service, exactly where and how is unclear from historical records, and had been carrying it as a supplementary weapon. Soldiers often carried personal weapons in addition to their issued equipment. Knives, brass knuckles, clubs, anything that might be useful in close-quarters combat. The Bolo knife was particularly useful for trench raids where fighting might be too close for rifles and where a heavy chopping blade could be devastating against enemy soldiers. When Johnson charged the Germans with his Bolo knife, he was essentially committing suicide by any rational calculation. He was one man with a knife against 24 men with rifles, bayonets, grenades, and every tactical advantage. He was already in the middle of their formation. They'd partially surrounded the listening post as they moved in to capture Roberts, which meant enemies were behind him, beside him, in front of him. Even if he killed several Germans, the others would kill him within seconds. But Johnson wasn't calculating odds. He was fighting on pure instinct and adrenaline, driven by loyalty to Roberts and by something deeper, anger at being told his entire life that black men were inferior, that they couldn't fight, that they didn't have the courage or capability to be real soldiers. Every German soldier Johnson fought was, in some way, every white person who'd ever treated him as less than human. Every officer who'd given black soldiers broken equipment because they weren't worth proper gear. Every American who'd said black men couldn't fight. Johnson swung the Bolo knife at the first German soldier in range. The blade caught the German in the upper body, shoulder, or neck, with enough force to knock him down. Johnson didn't stop to finish him off. He kept moving, kept swinging, using the knife's weight and his own momentum to generate striking power that compensated for his small size. A second German tried to bayonet Johnson. Johnson twisted away from the bayonet thrust. The German's rifle barrel passed close enough to Johnson's side that you feel it, and brought the Bolo knife down on the German's head or shoulder. The German fell. Johnson pulled the knife free and looked for the next target. The fight became a chaotic blur. Germans were shouting, trying to coordinate against Johnson, while also trying to grab Roberts and complete their mission. Johnson was fighting multiple enemies simultaneously, blocking a bayonet thrust from one German, while striking at another, constantly moving to keep from being surrounded, using the knife in short, powerful chops that didn't require precision, just speed and force. Johnson was shot. A German soldier, probably frustrated by the close-quarters chaos, fired his rifle at Johnson at nearly point-blank range. The bullet hit Johnson in the left side of his body, tearing through muscle and possibly grazing a rib. The impact knocked Johnson off balance but didn't drop him. The pain was intense, but Johnson's adrenaline was so high that he barely registered it. He turned toward the German who'd shot him and attacked with a knife. Johnson was shot again. A second bullet hit him in the left leg, just above the knee. This wound was more serious. It damaged muscle and possibly bone, and Johnson's left leg partially collapsed under him. He dropped to one knee, but kept fighting, using the knife in sweeping horizontal cuts that kept Germans at a distance. Johnson was shot a third time. This bullet hit him in the left arm, punching through the bicep muscle. Johnson's left arm went partially numb from nerve damage, but he was right-handed and was holding the knife in his right hand, so he could still fight. Germans were trying to bayonet Johnson. Multiple Germans with rifles and fixed bayonets were thrusting at him from different directions. Johnson was parrying some bayonet thrusts with the knife blade, dodging others, taking glancing wounds from bayonets that grazed his body, rather than penetrating deeply. One bayonet thrust cut across Johnson's head, leaving a deep gash in his scalp that bled profusely but didn't knock him unconscious. Another bayonet caught him in the right side, penetrating several inches into his torso, creating a serious wound that would have been fatal if it had gone deeper or hit vital organs. Johnson's uniform was soaked with blood, his own blood from multiple bullet and bayonet wounds. He was losing blood rapidly, weakening from blood loss and shock. His left leg wasn't supporting his weight properly, forcing the fight from a kneeling position. His left arm was barely functional. He'd been wounded seriously multiple times in perhaps 60 seconds of combat, wounds that would kill him if he didn't get medical attention soon. But Johnson kept fighting. He killed or seriously wounded 4 Germans with the Bolo knife. This number was confirmed by French investigators who examined the battlefield after the fight and counted German bodies with wounds consistent with a large blade rather than bullets or bayonets. Some German soldiers had been struck in the head or neck with enough force to kill them instantly. Others had severe cuts to their arms, shoulders, or bodies where they tried to defend themselves from Johnson's attacks and had been cut down anyway. Meanwhile, Needham Roberts, wounded, bleeding, unable to stand, was fighting back in the only way he could. Roberts had grabbed his rifle and was using it as a club, swinging it at any German who came within reach. He couldn't aim and fire the rifle properly because of his wounds, but he could still swing the heavy wooden stock at German soldiers' heads and bodies. Roberts hit at least one German hard enough to knock him down, buying Johnson a few more seconds to fight. The Germans were taking significant casualties. They'd come expecting to overwhelm a two-man listening post, capture the defenders without much trouble, and be back to German lines within minutes. Instead, they'd run into ferocious resistance from a man who refused to go down despite being shot multiple times, and they'd lost at least 4 men killed with several more wounded. The raid was turning into a disaster. At some point in the fight, probably about 30 minutes after the raid began, though time estimates in combat are notoriously unreliable, the Germans decided to withdraw. They'd failed to capture any prisoners, had taken casualties themselves, and the noise of the fight was sure to bring reinforcements from the American main trenches. Several Germans grabbed their wounded comrades and began retreating back to the cut barbed wire toward German lines. Johnson, still conscious despite his wounds, grabbed one of the German rifles lying on the ground, probably dropped by a German soldier Johnson had killed or wounded, and fired several shots at the retreating Germans. He hit at least one more German, possibly 2, before the rifle ran out of ammunition and the Germans disappeared into the darkness. Then Johnson collapsed. The adrenaline that had kept him fighting despite catastrophic wounds was fading, and the reality of his injuries was overwhelming his system. He'd been shot 3 times, bayonet multiple times, cut and bruised from hand-to-hand fighting, and had lost a massive amount of blood. He was going into shock, his blood pressure dropping, his consciousness fading. Roberts was in similar condition. He'd been wounded by grenade shrapnel at the beginning of the fight and had multiple serious wounds. He'd lost blood, was in severe pain, and couldn't move without help. Both men should have died. They were seriously wounded, isolated from medical help, losing blood, and going into shock. But French soldiers, alerted by the sound of fighting, arrived at the listening post about 30 minutes after the fight ended. They found Johnson and Roberts both alive, surrounded by German bodies and wounded Germans who'd been left behind when their comrades retreated. The medics who treated Johnson and Roberts at the scene were astonished that both men had survived. The severity of their wounds was such that death would have been the expected outcome. Johnson and Roberts were evacuated to a field hospital behind the lines. Doctors worked to stabilize their conditions, treating their wounds, giving blood transfusions, and fighting infections that inevitably developed from battlefield injuries. The official medical count would eventually list the 2 men as having sustained 21 wounds between them. Johnson had taken the majority of the wounds since he'd been the one actively fighting most of the Germans, while Roberts had been wounded primarily by the initial grenade explosions. Both men survived, though their recovery would be long and painful. Johnson's wounds were so severe that he'd never fully recover. He'd have chronic pain, limited mobility, and health problems for the rest of his life. Roberts would also suffer long-term effects from his injuries, but they had survived. And more importantly, they had won. They'd held their position, prevented the Germans from capturing prisoners, killed at least 4 enemy soldiers, wounded several more, and forced the Germans to retreat in failure. Against 24 attackers, 2 men had won. It was an extraordinary achievement, made more remarkable by the fact that both defenders were black soldiers fighting for a country that didn't respect them, using equipment that had jammed at the worst possible moment, relying on courage and determination rather than tactical advantages or superior firepower. Word of the fight spread quickly through the French 16th Division and then to the American forces. The French army launched an investigation to determine exactly what happened and to document Johnson and Roberts' actions for potential decorations. French officers went to the battlefield, examined the German bodies, interviewed Johnson and Roberts, and reconstructed the fight. The French investigators concluded that Johnson had killed at least 4 German soldiers in hand-to-hand combat with his Bolo knife and had wounded several more. Roberts had fought back despite being seriously wounded and had helped defend against the German raid. The French officers were impressed, not just by the bravery the 2 men had shown, but by the sheer ferocity of the fighting. To go after 24 enemy soldiers with a knife was either insane or extraordinarily courageous, and the French decided it was courage. On May 20th, 1918, just 5 days after battle, the French government awarded Henry Johnson the Croix de Guerre, France's 3rd highest military decoration, given for acts of heroism in combat. The decoration came with citation praising Johnson's extraordinary courage and devotion to duty in fighting off a German raid. Needham Roberts also received the Croix de Guerre for his part in the battle. The French took the battle seriously and treated Johnson and Roberts as heroes. But it was what happened when word reached the American military and American press that really made the Battle of Henry Johnson famous. American newspapers picked up the story and ran with it. Headlines screamed about the heroic fight. 2 black privates fight off 24 Germans. Henry Johnson kills for with knife. Harlem Hellfighters prove their courage. The story was sensational, dramatic, and exactly the kind of feel-good war news that the American public wanted to read. Johnson became famous virtually overnight. The most famous black soldier in America, a genuine war hero with French decorations to prove his valor. But there was a problem. The American military didn't want Henry Johnson to be famous. More specifically, the American military didn't want a black soldier to be famous as a combat hero because that contradicted the official position that black men couldn't fight effectively. The U.S. Army refused to recommend Johnson for the Medal of Honor or any other American military decoration. The official reason given was that Johnson had been fighting under French command at the time of the battle, not American command, so American decorations didn't apply. This was technically true, but conveniently ignored the fact that American soldiers fighting under French command in other circumstances had been recommended for American medals. The real reason was racism. The Army didn't want to honor a black soldier with America's highest military decoration because it would undermine the justification for keeping the military segregated. Some American officers tried to downplay Johnson's achievement. Reports circulated suggesting that Johnson had exaggerated the story, that there hadn't really been 24 Germans, that the fight hadn't been as intense as reported, that maybe the whole thing was a propaganda invention. These reports were contradicted by the French investigation, by physical evidence from the battlefield, by the testimony of French soldiers who'd arrived at the scene, and by the simple fact that both Johnson and Roberts had nearly died from their wounds. But the rumors persisted because some people in the American military wanted them to persist. The 369th Infantry Regiment continued fighting through the rest of 1918. They would serve a total of 191 days in combat, longer than any other American unit in World War I. During that time, the regiment never lost a foot of ground to the enemy, never had a man captured, and earned a reputation as one of the most effective fighting units in the American Expeditionary Force. The French military loved them. French soldiers respected them. French officers praised them, and the French government decorated numerous members of the regiment for valor. The American military mostly ignored their achievements. When the war ended in November 1918 and American units began returning home for victory parades and celebrations, the 369th was kept in France longer than white units, assigned to cleanup and occupation duties, and finally sent home months after other regiments. When they did return to New York in February 1919, the city organized a parade for them. Thousands of New Yorkers lined the streets to cheer the Harlem Hellfighters as they marched through Manhattan. Henry Johnson, still recovering from his wounds, marched in the parade and was celebrated as a hero. But the parade ended, the crowds went home, and Johnson and the other black soldiers of the 369th returned to an America that was still deeply segregated and racist. They fought for democracy in Europe. But they came home to a country that denied them the right to vote in many states, that enforced Jim Crow laws, that treated them as second-class citizens. They'd proven their courage and capability in combat, but American society didn't care. They were still black, and that meant they were still subject to all the discrimination and injustice that had existed before the war. Henry Johnson's life after the war was tragic. He couldn't find steady work, partially because of his war injuries, which left him with chronic pain and limited mobility, but also because employers in Albany weren't interested in hiring a black man, even if he was a war hero. He couldn't leverage his fame into a better life because his fame was mostly limited to black community, and white employers didn't care about his decorations or his service. Johnson spoke publicly about his experiences, giving speeches about the war and about the treatment of black soldiers. Some of these speeches were critical of how the military had treated black troops, how they'd been given inferior equipment and training, how they'd been assigned to labor duties rather than combat roles, how they'd been denied recognition for their achievements. Johnson's willingness to speak honestly about racism in the military made him unpopular with military authorities and with some white Americans who didn't want to hear that black soldiers had been mistreated. Johnson's health deteriorated. The wounds he'd sustained in combat caused ongoing problems, chronic infections, pain, limited mobility. He developed alcoholism, possibly as a way of coping with chronic pain and the disappointment of returning from war to a country that didn't appreciate his service. His marriage fell apart. He struggled financially, moving between jobs and often unemployed. Henry Johnson died on July 1st, 1929, at the age of 36 from myocarditis, heart inflammation, that was possibly related to his war wounds and definitely exacerbated by his alcoholism and poor living conditions. He died poor, largely forgotten except by members of the black community who remembered him as a hero. He was buried in Arlington National Cemetery with military honors, But there was no Medal of Honor, no recognition from the American government that he'd been one of the most courageous soldiers of World War I. Needham Roberts had a similarly difficult post-war life. He also struggled to find employment, dealt with health problems from his war wounds, and never received significant recognition from the American military. Roberts worked various jobs, married, and tried to build a normal life, but he was haunted by his wartime experiences and by the disappointment of being treated as a hero in France, but as just another black man in America. Roberts died in 1949 at the age of 48, having lived longer than Johnson but not much happier. The 369th Infantry Regiment's achievements were largely forgotten or downplayed in American military history for decades. Textbooks about World War I focus on white American units and white American heroes. The Harlem Hellfighters were mentioned briefly, if at all, and when they were mentioned, their achievements were minimized or described as exceptional cases rather than evidence that black soldiers were just as capable as white soldiers. But the story didn't end with Johnson's death. Over the following decades, historians began re-examining the records of black soldiers in World War I and documenting the systematic discrimination they'd faced. The civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s brought renewed attention to the contributions of black Americans in military service and injustice of denying them recognition. In 1996, more than 65 years after his death, Henry Johnson was awarded the Purple Heart, the American military decoration given to soldiers wounded in combat. It was a small gesture, but significant. Official recognition from the U.S. military that Johnson had been wounded in service to his country. But the real recognition came in 2015. President Barack Obama, America's first black president, awarded the Medal of Honor posthumously to Henry Johnson, 97 years after the Battle of Henry Johnson. The Medal of Honor is the United States' highest military decoration, awarded only for extraordinary valor in combat beyond the call of duty. Johnson's descendants attended the ceremony at the White House to receive the medal on his behalf. In his remarks at the ceremony, President Obama noted the injustice of denying Johnson the Medal of Honor during his lifetime. Henry Johnson was one of the bravest Americans to ever wear the uniform. He deserved the Medal of Honor long ago, but we are righting that wrong today. His story reminds us that the fight for equality and dignity has never been easy, and that the soldiers who defended our freedom abroad were too often denied their own freedom at home. The Medal of Honor citation for Henry Johnson reads, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, Private Henry Johnson distinguished himself by acts of gallantry and intrepidity above and beyond the call of duty while serving as a member of Company C, 369th Infantry Regiment, 93rd Division, American Expeditionary Forces, during combat operations against an armed enemy on the front lines of the Western Front in France on May 15, 1918. Private Johnson and a fellow soldier were on sentry duty at a forward outpost when they received a surprise attack from a German raiding party consisting of at least 12 soldiers. While under intense enemy fire and despite receiving significant wounds, Private Johnson mounted a brave retaliation, resulting in several enemy casualties. When his fellow soldier was badly wounded, Private Johnson prevented him from being taken prisoner by German forces. Private Johnson exposed himself to grave danger by advancing from his position to engage an enemy soldier in hand-to-hand combat. Private Johnson sustained multiple injuries during the fight, but displayed extraordinary heroism in defending his fellow soldier, which ultimately forced the German raiding party to retreat. Private Johnson's extraordinary heroism and selflessness above and beyond the call of duty are in keeping with the highest traditions of military service and reflect great credit upon himself, his unit, and the United States Army. The citation is understated, as military citations tend to be, but it captures the essential facts. Johnson fought at least 12 Germans. The citation uses conservative estimate of German numbers rather than a higher estimate of 24, sustained multiple serious wounds, prevented Roberts from being captured, and fought hand-to-hand with enemy soldiers, forcing them to retreat. The 2015 Medal of Honor award brought renewed attention to Henry Johnson's story and to the broader history of the Harlem Hellfighters. The 369th Infantry Regiment's achievements were finally properly recognized. Their 191 days in combat, their record of never losing ground or having men captured, their reputation among French forces as elite fighters, and the systematic discrimination they faced from the American military that should have honored them but instead denied them recognition because of their race. The story of Henry Johnson and the Harlem Hellfighters matters for several reasons beyond the specific facts of battle on May 15, 1918. First, it's a story about courage under impossible odds. Johnson faced 24 enemy soldiers with a knife and refused to surrender or retreat. That kind of courage isn't about size or physical strength. Johnson was a small man by any standard. It's about character, about determination, about loyalty to comrades, and about refusal to accept defeat even when defeat seems inevitable. Second, it's a story about racism and injustice. Black soldiers volunteer to fight for America despite systematic discrimination. They serve with distinction despite being given inferior equipment and training. They performed heroically despite being told they lacked the courage and capability to fight. And when they returned home, they were denied the recognition they'd earned and forced to continue living in a segregated, racist society. The American military's refusal to honor Johnson with the Medal of Honor during his lifetime, and the 97-year delay before that wrong was corrected, is a stark illustration of how racism operated at institutional levels and how long it took for justice to be achieved. Third, it's a story about loyalty and brotherhood. Johnson could save himself by retreating when the Germans attacked. He chose to stay and fight because Roberts was wounded and couldn't defend himself. That loyalty, the refusal to abandon a wounded comrade, even when staying meant almost certain death, is one of the highest values in military culture and one of the purest forms of courage. Fourth, it's a story about the long arc of history bending toward justice. Henry Johnson died poor and largely forgotten, denied the recognition he deserved. But his story survived, passed down through families and communities, documented by historians who refused to let his achievements be erased. Eventually, nearly a century after the battle, Johnson received the honor he'd earned. Too late to benefit him personally, but not too late to correct the historical record and to acknowledge that injustice was done. The Harlem Hellfighters, including Henry Johnson, helped pave the way for the integration of the American military and for the broader civil rights movement. They proved that black soldiers could fight as well as any soldiers, that courage and capability had nothing to do with race, and that discrimination and segregation were based on prejudice rather than fact. Their service and their treatment by the American military became a powerful argument for change, used by civil rights activists to demand equal treatment and equal opportunity. When President Harry Truman issued Executive Order 9981 in 1948, ordering the integration of the United States Armed Forces, he was building on a foundation laid by soldiers like Johnson and the Harlem Hellfighters. The order didn't reference them specifically, but their example, and the example of other black soldiers in World War I, World War II, and Korea, made it impossible to continue justifying segregation in the military. Henry Johnson died at age 36, broken by war and broken by racism, denied the recognition he deserved. But his legacy lives on. The small man with a big knife who charged into impossible odds and won, who refused to let his wounded partner be captured, who fought with courage that earned respect from French soldiers and eventual recognition from his own country. That legacy can't be erased by decades of injustice. When British officers found Latchman Gurung at dawn surrounded by bodies, they asked him what happened. His answer was simple: they kept coming. I kept shooting. When French officers asked Henry Johnson what happened during the battle, his answer was similarly direct. I did what I had to do. Roberts was down, and I couldn't let them take him. That's the essence of military courage. Not complicated strategy or overwhelming force, but simple determination to do your duty regardless of the odds, to protect your comrades regardless of the cost, and keep fighting even when fighting seems hopeless. Henry Johnson kept fighting, and in doing so, he proved something that shouldn't have needed proving but did. That black soldiers were every bit as brave, capable, and worthy of honor as any soldiers in any army. He proved it with a BOLO knife against 24 Germans, proved it with 21 wounds sustained in defense of a wounded comrade, and proved it by surviving long enough to be celebrated as a hero before America's racism killed him more slowly than German bullets had. The Medal of Honor awarded in 2015 was 97 years too late, but it was still worth awarding, still worth acknowledging that Henry Johnson was one of the bravest Americans to ever wear the uniform, still worth ensuring that his story wouldn't be forgotten, because some stories need to be remembered. The story of the smallest man who charged the most enemies. The story of the unwanted soldiers who proved they belonged. The story of justice delayed but not denied. The story of Henry Johnson, the Harlem Hellfighter who fought impossible odds and won.